let me begin by saying something that may challenge the way many of us have been trained to think. Poverty is not first a number in a bank account. It is not first an empty wallet or an unpaid bill. Poverty, before it ever becomes visible in circumstances, establishes itself in the inner world of the human mind and spirit. Long before money is absent, expectation is absent. Long before opportunity is missed, belief has already been restricted. That is why Scripture so often addresses the heart before it addresses provision. When the Psalm speaks about the Lord as shepherd, refuge, provider, and sustainer, it is not offering poetic comfort alone. It is dismantling a worldview. The Psalm confronts the internal logic of scarcity, the quiet assumption that there is never enough, that struggle is normal, that survival is the highest form of life. These assumptions do not appear overnight. They are learned through environment, reinforced through repeated disappointment, and passed down through generations as if they were facts rather than beliefs. Psychologically, poverty thinking functions like a self-preserving mechanism. It trains the mind to expect loss, to avoid risk, and to settle for less in order to prevent pain. Philosophically, it reduces life to mere endurance rather than purpose. Spiritually, it becomes a stronghold, a pattern of thought that resists hope even when provision is available. This is why two people can receive the same opportunity, the same resources, the same promise, and yet experience entirely different outcomes. One sees possibility, the other sees danger. The Psalm disrupts this internal narrative by redefining source. It declares again and again that provision does not originate in systems, employers, economies, or favorable conditions. It originates in God. When the source changes in your thinking, your relationship with circumstances changes automatically. Fear loses its authority because it no longer controls supply. Anxiety weakens because it no longer predicts outcome. The mind begins to shift from survival mode to stewardship mode. This is where the spiritual dimension becomes critical. A spirit of poverty does not only say, "You lack." It says, "You will always lack." It attaches identity to limitation. It convinces a person that abundance is for others, not for them. The Psalm confronts this lie by anchoring identity in divine relationship. If the Lord is your provider, then lack is a condition, not a destiny. If God is your refuge, then instability is temporary, not permanent. Notice how the language of the Psalm does not deny difficulty. It acknowledges valleys, enemies, pressure, and uncertainty, but it refuses to let those realities define the future. This is an important psychological principle. Denial weakens faith, but perspective strengthens it. The Psalm trains the mind to see beyond the immediate moment without escaping it. It teaches trust without passivity, confidence without arrogance. When spoken consistently, this Psalm begins to rewire internal expectations. Neuroscience confirms what Scripture has long revealed: repeated words shape belief, and belief shapes behavior. As the words of the Psalm replace fear-based inner dialogue, decisions begin to change. Actions become more deliberate. Creativity reawakens. Courage returns. These are not emotional reactions, they are cognitive realignments. And this is why poverty must be addressed at the level of thought and spirit before it can be addressed at the level of finance. Money flows most freely where fear does not dominate. Opportunity multiplies where faith governs decision-making. The Psalm does not magically deposit wealth, but it removes the internal resistance that blocks growth, discipline, and obedience. So the question is not whether poverty has touched your life. The question is whether it has been allowed to define your thinking. This Psalm invites you to make a decisive shift, to stop rehearsing limitation and start declaring alignment. Because the moment your inner world changes, your outer world is already on its way to transformation. Once the inner world begins to shift, the next place this transformation must take root is in the space where life is lived every day, the home. A home is not just a physical structure made of walls and furniture, it is an atmosphere. It carries memory, language, expectation, and emotional residue. Psychologically and spiritually, homes become training grounds where beliefs are reinforced quietly through repetition. What is spoken there, what is feared there, what is expected there, eventually becomes normalized. That is why the Psalm does not remain a private meditation. It is meant to be voiced, lived, and released into shared space. When Scripture is spoken aloud, something profound happens. Words are not neutral, they are carriers of meaning and authority. Philosophy has long understood language as a creator of reality, not merely a descriptor of it. The Psalm, when spoken in the home, begins to interrupt the unseen narratives that have been shaping the household atmosphere. Fear-based language. We can't afford this. Things never change. We always struggle. Slowly loses dominance. In its place, a new framework emerges, one rooted in trust, order, and expectation. This is not about ignoring practical realities. Bills still exist, responsibilities remain, but the emotional tone changes. Anxiety no longer defines conversation. Desperation no longer dictates decisions. The psalm introduces a different emotional rhythm, calm instead of panic, confidence instead of tension. Over time, this shift influences behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Parents become less reactive. Children absorb security rather than fear. Decisions are made from clarity rather than pressure. From a psychological standpoint, repeated exposure to hopeful, stabilizing language restructures perception. The human brain adapts to the emotional climate it inhabits most often. When a home is saturated with words of provision and trust, the nervous system responds accordingly. Stress hormones decrease. Cognitive flexibility increases. People become more open to learning, planning, and creative problem solving. This is not mystical speculation. It is the measurable effect of a regulated emotional environment. Spiritually, the psalm functions as a declaration of authority. It establishes what governs the home. Every household operates under some governing belief, either fear, control, scarcity, or trust. When the psalm is spoken consistently, it signals a change in governance. It announces that the home is no longer ruled by lack, but aligned with divine order. This alignment does not eliminate struggle overnight, but it changes the direction in which the household is moving. Consider how habits form within families. Patterns of spending, saving, working, and even dreaming are often inherited unconsciously. The psalm disrupts these patterns by introducing intentionality. It invites the household to pause, reflect, and realign daily life with higher principles. Conversations shift from complaint to strategy, from resignation to responsibility, from survival to stewardship. What makes this powerful is its accessibility. You do not need advanced theology or perfect discipline. You need consistency and sincerity. Speaking the psalm daily, during moments of calm or tension, gradually reshapes the emotional and spiritual architecture of the home. It becomes a shared language, a shared rhythm, a shared reminder of source and direction. Over time, visitors feel the difference. Children carry the atmosphere into their future relationships. Decisions made within that home begin to reflect stability rather than fear. This is how transformation becomes generational, not through dramatic events, but through faithful repetition. So do not underestimate the power of what you speak where you live. A home aligned in language is a home aligned in direction. And when the atmosphere changes, outcomes eventually follow. Speak intentionally, live attentively, and let your home become a place where scarcity has no authority to stay. As the atmosphere of the home begins to change, the next question that naturally arises is this: where does provision truly come from? Many people, even those of faith, quietly believe that prosperity is largely a matter of timing, connections, or good fortune. When things go well, they call it luck. When they do not, they assume they were simply overlooked. But the psalm challenges this thinking at its core. It insists that provision is not random, and it is not reserved for a select few. It flows from covenant. A covenant is not a transaction. It is a relationship governed by trust, responsibility, and mutual commitment. Psychologically, covenant thinking shifts a person from a passive posture to an active one. Instead of waiting for favorable circumstances, the individual begins to live with intentional alignment. Instead of asking, "Will things work out?" the question becomes, "Am I positioned correctly?" This subtle shift produces profound behavioral change. The psalm repeatedly anchors provision in relationship with God rather than external systems. This does not deny the existence of systems, work markets, institutions, but it refuses to grant them ultimate authority. Philosophically, this restores agency. When people believe their future is controlled entirely by forces beyond them, motivation erodes. Responsibility feels meaningless. But when provision is understood as covenantal, effort regains purpose. Discipline becomes meaningful. Integrity becomes non-negotiable. This is why the psalm often connects provision with character. Trust, obedience, and alignment are not moral decorations, they are structural elements. They position a person to recognize opportunity, manage resources, and sustain growth. Many people receive increase but cannot hold it because their inner framework is incompatible with abundance. Covenant thinking develops that framework over time. Notice also how covenant dismantles comparison. Luck-based thinking breeds envy and resentment. It constantly measures self against others, leading to discouragement or pride. Covenant-based provision removes this pressure. Each person's journey becomes distinct, governed by calling rather than competition. This has deep psychological implications. Peace replaces anxiety. Focus replaces distraction. Energy is no longer wasted on resentment, but invested in growth. The psalm does not promise instant results, and that is intentional. It speaks of seasons, processes, and pathways. This trains patience without promoting passivity. Covenant requires participation. It calls for stewardship, wisdom, and generosity even before visible reward appears. Philosophically, this aligns with the principle that meaning precedes outcome. When actions are grounded in purpose rather than reward, consistency becomes possible. Generosity, in particular, reveals covenant thinking. A scarcity mindset hoards because it fears loss. Covenant thinking gives because it trusts continuity. This is not reckless giving, but principled generosity. It acknowledges that resources are not owned absolutely, but managed responsibly. This mindset transforms the emotional relationship with money. Money becomes a tool rather than a master. As this understanding settles, fear begins to loosen its grip. Fear thrives in uncertainty and randomness. Covenant introduces structure. It assures the mind that outcomes are connected to alignment, not chaos. Even when results are delayed, despair does not dominate because meaning remains intact. What the psalm ultimately teaches is this: provision is not about chasing abundance. It is about walking in alignment. When alignment is established, provision follows in forms often unexpected but always purposeful. This does not remove effort, it redeems it. Work becomes partnership rather than struggle. So reflect carefully on where you have placed your trust. If your hope rests solely in chance, systems, or people, anxiety will always have a voice. But if your life is anchored in covenant, stability becomes possible even in uncertainty. Align first, trust deeply, act faithfully. Because when provision flows from relationship, it is sustained not by luck, but by purpose. Once covenant becomes the foundation, another force begins to reveal itself: fear. Fear is often subtle. It rarely announces itself loudly. More often it disguises itself as caution, logic, or realism. It whispers that now is not the right time, that the risk is too great, that failure would be too costly. Over time, fear does not just delay action, it shapes identity. A person begins to see themselves as someone who must play small to stay safe. This is where the spirit of poverty finds one of its strongest allies. The psalm confronts fear not by denying danger, but by redefining trust. It consistently redirects attention away from threat and toward presence. Psychologically, this is critical. Fear narrows perception. It reduces complex possibilities into a single negative outcome. Faith, by contrast, expands perception. It allows the mind to hold uncertainty without being dominated by it. When faith is activated, the brain shifts from avoidance mode to engagement mode. Creativity returns, initiative awakens, fear blocks action because it magnifies potential loss while minimizing potential growth. Many people are not limited by lack of opportunity, but by reluctance to move when opportunity appears. The psalm speaks into this paralysis by affirming that protection and guidance are not absent during movement. In other words, safety is not found in stillness alone. It is found in alignment. This reframes action from reckless risk to faithful response. Philosophically, fear is rooted in the illusion of control. It convinces the individual that if they avoid movement, they can avoid pain. Yet life does not reward avoidance, it rewards engagement. The psalm challenges this illusion by reminding us that control has never been the source of security. Trust has. When trust replaces control, action becomes possible even without certainty. Notice how often fear influences financial decisions. People avoid learning new skills because they fear failure. They avoid investment in growth because they fear loss. They avoid generosity because they fear scarcity. Each avoidance feels rational in isolation, but collectively they reinforce stagnation. The psalm disrupts this cycle by reconnecting action to faith rather than outcome. It teaches that obedience precedes clarity, not the other way around. As fear loosens its grip, behavior begins to shift. Decisions become intentional rather than reactive. Planning replaces panic. Effort becomes focused rather than scattered. This is not emotional enthusiasm, it is disciplined courage. The psalm nurtures this courage by repeatedly affirming presence, guidance, and continuity. It does not promise ease, but it promises accompaniment. There is also a communal dimension to fear. When fear governs a household, it spreads through tone, silence, and expectation. Children learn caution before they learn confidence. Partners hesitate to dream because disappointment has become familiar. The psalm interrupts this transmission by modeling a different response to uncertainty. It teaches how to speak faith without denying challenge, how to move forward without demanding guarantees. Faith-based action does not eliminate failure, but it reframes it. Failure becomes information rather than condemnation. Growth replaces shame. This psychological shift is essential for long-term progress. Without it, even success becomes fragile, always threatened by the next uncertainty. The psalm, therefore, does not simply comfort the fearful, it mobilizes them. It restores the connection between belief and movement. It reminds us that provision often waits on participation. Doors open for those willing to approach them. Paths appear for those willing to walk. So examine where fear has been quietly negotiating your decisions. Ask yourself what action faith would authorize if fear were not present. Then move not recklessly, but deliberately. Because the moment faith begins to act, fear begins to lose its power. And when fear no longer governs your steps, growth becomes not just possible, but inevitable. As faith begins to replace fear and action starts to align with trust, another reality must be addressed, one that often operates beneath awareness. Poverty is frequently inherited long before it is experienced, not only in financial terms, but in expectations, habits, and unspoken beliefs. Many people are not struggling because of what they have done wrong, but because of what they were taught to believe was normal. The psalm speaks directly into this deeper layer, confronting the idea that limitation is destiny. Generational poverty is sustained through repetition. Children observe how adults talk about money, opportunity, authority, and risk. They internalize emotional responses to pressure, panic, avoidance, resignation. Over time, these responses become instinctive. Psychologically, this creates a closed loop. The mind expects scarcity, behaves accordingly, and then interprets the resulting lack as confirmation. The cycle continues, often unquestioned. The psalm interrupts this loop by introducing a new narrative, one that does not begin with family history, but with divine intention. It reframes identity away from inheritance of lack and toward inheritance of promise. This shift is subtle but profound. When people stop asking, "This is how it has always been," and begin asking, "What has been made available to me?" new possibilities emerge. Philosophically, this challenges determinism. It rejects the idea that the past has absolute authority over the future. While history influences behavior, it does not have to govern it. The psalm insists that alignment with God's principles creates a new trajectory, one that can diverge sharply from inherited patterns. This does not erase history, it redeems it. Breaking generational patterns requires conscious interruption. Automatic behaviors must be examined. Emotional reactions must be questioned. The psalm provides language for this interruption. When spoken, it creates distance between identity and history. It allows a person to observe inherited beliefs rather than obey them. This awareness is the first step toward change. Notice how the psalm speaks of blessing extending beyond the individual. It addresses households, descendants, and future generations. This is not symbolic language. It reflects a systemic understanding of human behavior. What one generation normalizes, the next inherits. Therefore, transformation must be intentional if it is to be lasting. As individuals begin to live differently, speaking differently, deciding differently, they model an alternative pattern. Children raised in an atmosphere of trust develop resilience rather than fear. They learn planning instead of panic. They internalize responsibility rather than helplessness. This is how spiritual interruption becomes generational renewal. It is important to recognize that breaking these cycles is not immediate. Resistance is common. Old patterns assert themselves, especially under stress. But persistence matters more than perfection. Each consistent choice weakens the old structure and strengthens the new one. Over time, what once felt unnatural becomes normal. The psalm supports this process by providing continuity. It offers a stable reference point when emotions fluctuate. It reminds the individual that they are not alone in the work of change. This reduces psychological fatigue. It sustains motivation. Ultimately, generational poverty loses its authority not through confrontation alone, but through replacement. Old narratives are replaced with new ones. Old habits are replaced with disciplined practices. Old fears are replaced with informed faith. So understand this clearly. You are not dishonoring your past by choosing differently. You are honoring it by refusing to let its limitations define the future. Speak the psalm not only for yourself, but for those who will come after you. Because when one generation decides to change direction, the impact echoes far beyond a single lifetime. When all of these shifts begin to take place, when the inner world is renewed, the atmosphere of the home is transformed, covenant replaces luck, fear loses its authority, and generational patterns are interrupted, one final alignment becomes necessary. It is alignment with what we might call God's economy. Not an abstract idea of heaven, but a practical way of thinking, deciding, and living that operates by different principles than the systems of scarcity we see around us. Most economic systems are driven by fear, fear of not having enough, fear of losing status, fear of falling behind. God's economy, as revealed through the psalm, is driven by trust, order, and purpose. This is why speaking the psalm is not a ritual, it is a realignment. Each time it is spoken, it recalibrates the mind away from anxiety and toward responsibility. Psychologically, this matters because the brain functions best when guided by clear values rather than constant threat assessment. Alignment begins with stewardship. In a scarcity system, people cling to what they have. In God's economy, people manage what they have. This difference is subtle but powerful. Management implies growth, planning, and accountability. Clinging implies fear and stagnation. The psalm trains the believer to see resources, time, skill, relationships, finances as entrusted rather than owned. This mindset encourages discipline without desperation. Another principle of God's economy is generosity. Not emotional giving, not pressured giving, but purposeful generosity. Psychologically, generosity breaks the internal grip of fear. It teaches the nervous system that release does not result in collapse. Over time, this rewires the brain's relationship with security. People who practice generosity from a place of trust often report increased clarity, focus, and resilience. These are not coincidences, they are outcomes of alignment. God's economy also values patience. Modern systems reward speed and immediate return. The psalm consistently emphasizes timing, seasons, and endurance. Philosophically, this restores depth to decision-making. It allows people to invest in long-term growth rather than chasing short-term relief. Patience becomes strength rather than weakness. Consistency becomes more valuable than intensity. When the psalm is spoken daily, it functions like a compass. It does not remove choice, but it informs it. Decisions begin to pass through a different filter. The question shifts from, what gives me the fastest relief? To, what aligns me most fully? This shift protects against impulsive behavior, financial or otherwise. It promotes sustainability. Alignment with God's economy also restores peace. Peace is not the absence of challenge, but the presence of order. When actions align with principles, internal conflict decreases. Anxiety no longer dominates because decisions are coherent. Even setbacks are processed differently, not as personal failure, but as part of a larger journey. This alignment does not exempt anyone from effort. In fact, it often demands more discipline, not less. But the effort is no longer driven by panic. It is driven by purpose. Work becomes meaningful. Growth becomes intentional. Success becomes sustainable, and this brings us to the heart of the psalm's power. Speaking it daily is not about changing God's response to you. It is about changing your response to life. It positions you to recognize opportunity, steward increase, and endure challenge without losing direction. So let the psalm become more than words you admire. Let it become a framework you live by. Speak it until it shapes your thinking. Live it until it guides your decisions. Because when your life aligns with God's economy, scarcity loses its authority, and purpose takes its place.